How do you convince people to make better health choices? This is the million-life question most public health organisations have been asking themselves this year. Treaties have been written about how to use social engineering, positive education programs, and careful tax systems to coax people towards better health decisions. This was expertly shown in the UK with anti-smoking legislation, which engaged in social engineering to drop smoking rates from 1/3 to below 1/5 inside a decade. Unfortunately, this lesson is very hard learnt, and most people still seem to believe that the best way to educate people about health is just to shout at them and scare them until they agree with you. I tend to think of this as the Daily Mail list of things that give you cancer school of scientific education, and in my opinion, it is this interfering busybody approach that is largely responsible for creating a society where most people distrust science. It was with this in mind that I read this report. The hysterical article reports on a recent study linking domestic fires to dementia and an ambiguous host of other health problems. The article calls on woke individuals to put out their fires, chucking in a call to stop making s'mores for good measure, due to the imminent and deadly health risk they pose. This article represents the very worst method of scientific communication. Its claims are hyperbolic and extreme, the actual science is barely discussed, and the conclusions are left deliberately vague and sinister. This story is sure to raise the hackles of almost any reasonable person, but no matter how much this sort of shit annoys me, I am a scientist, and I won't make up my mind until I've seen the data. This would of course be made easier if the author had included a link to the study. Unfortunately, the link which claims to be to the original work is actually to a Times article, which definitely raises a red flag. The article does, however, name the study's author, a Professor Barbara Mayer of Lancaster University. Going to her staff page, we find a recent paper titled Indoor Particular Air Pollution from Open Fires and the Cognitive Function of Older People. Already this implies something rather different to the Hysterical Guardian article, more long-term incremental changes in Alzheimer's risk than immediate endangerment. The paper studies the links between indoor air pollution from open fires and dementia, focusing on the dreaded P2.5 particles, fine material with diameters of around 2.5 microns. This material is considered dangerous because it can penetrate deep into the lungs, causing scarring and damage, and can even be absorbed into the blood where it can accumulate in organs, including the brain. These fine particles have been a touchstone of public health campaigning recently due to their association with traffic pollution in cities. In 2018, the UK government commissioned a vast meta-analysis, the COMEP, or Committee on Medical Effects of Air Pollutants, to determine the links between air pollution and mortality in the UK population. The report was notably reluctant to draw any firm conclusions about the connection between a specific type of pollution and increased mortality, but did conclude that there was a 96% probability that chronic elevations in P2.5 exposure were weakly correlated to increased mortality. The reason for the hedging of this conclusion was that many different types of air pollution tend to coincide, making it near impossible to separate the effects of, say, P2.5 particles from nitrous oxide. I mention this because it will be an important point of comparison for later on. One of the key papers used by the COMEP was a 2002 study by C. Pope et al., which plotted the correlations between lung cancer rates and chronically elevated levels of P2.5 exposure over a 16-year period. This data showed clear correlation within a 95% confidence interval that an increase in chronic P2.5 exposure of 10 micrograms per meter cubed caused an 8% increase in mortality from lung cancer. This new study attempts to measure the P2.5 emissions from domestic fires burning peat, coal, and wood. The emission is measured by placing a pump 0.5 meters from the fire to simulate a person breathing. Wait, what? 0.5 meters? That is pretty damn close. I feel like there might be a more obvious cause of mortality if old people are sitting that close to a roaring fire. But whatever, maybe they're taking an extreme case to prove a point. The inlet of the pump has two filters in it, first a 10 micrometer filter and second a 2.5 micrometer filter. In tandem, these two filters will allow the authors to isolate particles of around 2.5 micrometers diameter. By weighing the filters before and after exposure to the fire, they can find the total accumulated mass over the measurement cycle and use that to find the concentration by volume of these particles in the air. However, I note that there is no control measurement in the paper, meaning we actually have no idea if this mass is that collected from the fire or just the room in general. Lacking a control measurement is a pretty basic error and definitely raises a red flag. There's some other weird stuff about this data as well. The table doesn't give the actual measured masses, no raw data, red flag, but the concentration per cubic meter and the micrograms collected per hour. This processed data has no error associated with it, so we have no idea what sort of confidence to have in these measurements. There are some clear problems with the calculations here. In 1 hour, a pump running at 2 litres per minute goes through 0.12 cubic metres of air. The concentration is then the amount of material collected over an hour divided by that processed volume. For the values given for peat, this would give a concentration of 42.5 divided by 0.12, or 354 micrograms per cubic metre, not 60. For wood, it would give 181, and for coal, 231. Even the ratios are all wrong. By volume, peat concentrations are 3.5 times higher than wood, but collected over 1 hour on the same flow rate pump, they are only 1.9 times higher. I don't know what's wrong here because I don't have the raw data, but this certainly throws the rest of the paper into doubt. If we took these figures at face value, the increase in concentration of P2.5 particles would constitute a 48%, 24% and 13% increase in cancer rates for peat, coal and wood respectively. For comparison, the increased rate of cancer for smoking 1 pack a day for 20 years, as estimated by Cancer Research UK, is 2,600%. So we can safely label the Guardian's claim that lighting a fire for Christmas will have Jack Frost hacking up his guts as utter anti-scientific bullshit. But no one wants to increase their chances of getting cancer, even if it's only by 50%, so let's look into this a bit more. The increased P2.5 levels were those recorded while the fire was burning, over a 20-hour period for wood and coal and 48 hours for peat. That's weird. Why would they not use the same protocol in each case? That's a red flag. But the Pope article specifies that the increase in risk of cancer is a result of long-term elevations in the average P2.5 ambient concentration. Fortunately, this paper accounts for this, calculating the elevation in average P2.5 levels based on reasonable fire usage. In Table 2, they outline doses of P2.5 particles over a year. Burning a fire for 5 hours a day, 7 days a week for 6 months will cause an excess dosage of... Wait, what? 5 hours a day, 7 days a week for 6 months? Where was this study performed? Svalbard? This really hits the nail on the head with regard to what is wrong with this study specifically, and also a lot of public health research. Like many similar scares, the exciting story is based only on the most extreme case. The reality is that if you indulge in unhealthy behaviour only occasionally, and you use common sense precautions to protect yourself, such as not sitting so close to the fire that you cook yourself, your level of risk is so low as to be meaningless. To show this, we can calculate the expected increase in lung cancer mortality for a more normal level of exposure. I'll assume from personal experience that most modern households light fires for social or aesthetic purposes, usually in winter months. Based on this, let's say that the average person will light a fire twice a week for around 3 hours for 3 months of the year. This totals about 72 hours per year sat near the fire. Taking the concentrations in this study, that would elevate average P2.5 exposure from a peat fire by 0.49 micrograms per cubic meter, or an increase in cancer risk of 0.39% over your entire lifetime. That is a long way down from the 48% calculated before. But of course, if we actually read the study, it's not about lung cancer at all, or COPD or lung damage, even though this is what the Guardian seemed to imply. It's actually about dementia. This is a bit more subtle, since dementia has many complex and idiopathic causes that might be down to combinations of subtle factors occurring over one's entire life. The fire usage data here might also be more realistic if we now consider that older people might have used fires differently in the past, before central heating was common. In order to explore the correlations between fire use and dementia, the authors use the TILDA, or the Irish Longitudinal Study of Aging. We have 4 indices for cognitive decline, organised by whether the assessed person had a fire or not. It is a bit of a red flag that there is no plot showing this correlation, and instead we just have to infer it from tables and tables of data. But while it is difficult to read, the necessary information does all seem to be there. Table 3 seems to show that all 4 measures of cognitive decline are worse among people who had fires as their main source of heating. The strength of this correlation is stated as a p-value. The nature of this value is never explained, but I assume it is derived from the OLS test described later on. Loosely then, this is the chance that the observed correlation is wrong. But despite the bad stats, it is tempting to draw some tentative conclusion from the relationship between cognitive decline and fire use. That is, until we look at the other recorded health factors. In particular, it is clear in these tables that greater cognitive decline is also correlated to income, education, social contact, and smoking. Interesting, since all those are known risk factors in dementia. Now, I should say that the authors claim they have estimated multivariate models of the association between cognitive function and open fire usage in order to account for relevant co-founders such as socioeconomic status. However, while they do attempt to discount the correlation for socioeconomic status with the same dodgy stats as before, I couldn't find anywhere in the paper that convincingly disproved a correlation between smoking and cognitive decline. They even include this baffling statement. Additionally, users of open fires had worse health behaviours. Users of open fires were more likely to smoke at the time of the survey, which almost seems to imply that smoking is a result of fire-induced cognitive decline, when surely the obvious conclusion is that smoking, which is a well-known factor in long-term health conditions, is causing cognitive decline. It is notable that the ambiguity in this study is very similar to that in the COMEP meta-analysis, but the COMEP had no hesitation in admitting that their conclusions were ambiguous, whereas this study attempts to take equally confused data and sells it as a strong proof that open fires are causing dementia. This speaks to a fundamental difference in approach, where the commissioned report is trying to be as cautious in its conclusions as possible, and the published paper is trying to sell the most newsworthy interpretation possible, even if it is weakly supported. Unfortunately, this is pretty common in science these days, especially medical sciences. Recent investigations into the reproducibility crisis found that around 70% of published scientific work cannot be replicated by peers, but for medical sciences, that figure rises to 90%. Okay, conclusions. I am hesitant to cast too great aspersions on scientists I don't know, but I have to say I don't think much of this paper at all. It is riddled with red flags due to bad methodology and analysis, and the stats used to draw conclusions from the data are very weak. At best, it might imply a link between open fires and health in the most extreme cases, but realistically there is no way this study can be used to support a call for banning open fires. As is so often the case, The Guardian have taken what was, in fact, quite a limited study and blown it out of all proportion. But while the standard of reporting here is certainly terrible, it is not fair to entirely blame the journalist. The authors of the original study have deliberately highlighted an extreme case and failed to accurately communicate that with the reporter. The study's author apparently said, "Open fires are essentially harming friends and family every day. We discovered that the level of exposure to particulate matter from open fires is comparable to and may well exceed the levels people are exposed to from roadside sources." This statement is simply not supported by their data. If I were cynical, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily what has happened here, I would say that this demonstrates perfectly a trend in medical research to court public controversy in order to publicise one's work. This kind of media-focused science is a big part of why the world is wrapped up in the shitstorm it is. Ultimately, there is an impassable gulf between accurate science and sensational news. The latter might help to attract funding, but only the former is going to help keep people alive.